Greetings everyone, and welcome to this week's comic book video. Continuing on with the horror theme, I've dug a few treasures out of the deepest recesses of my comic book collection. In fact, some of the very first horror comics I was ever exposed to as an impressionable young lad. That's what we're going to take a look at today on the Multimedia Chronicles. Welcome back. Well, the other collectors out there, among you watching, will probably cringe at the somewhat ratty condition of these ones. Just remember, I got these when I was quite young and didn't know anything about taking care of comics at the time. That said, they're actually not in too bad a condition. They're, all the pages are still in them anyway. So, let's start at the beginning. The very first horror comic I ever got as a kid was a little gem from Modern Comics called Creepy Things. Ooh. Now, in the 70s, and I guess partly through the 60s and well into the 80s, there was a lot of comics like this out. They were essentially anthology horror comics, a collection of various short stories with people encountering strange things or murders or whatever, and usually meeting some sometimes justified, sometimes not so justified, sometimes just tragic, but meeting some horrible fate at the end. And, well, Creepy Things was no exception to that. Before we get into Creepy Things, everybody remembers, of course, good old Tales from the Crypt and Vault of Horror and crime suspense stories and weird science. No, not the John Hughes movie. I'm talking about the 50s horror comics. All that great stuff published by EC Comics back in the 50s, which of course got them in a lot of trouble back then. And it was actually largely because of EC Comics getting into trouble for their horror comics and whatnot that brought about the introduction of the Comics Code, which basically, from that point forward, comics had to meet the standards of the Comics Code in order to be approved for being sold on the newsstands. Now, of course, we have specialty comic stores where essentially anything goes, but if it's on the newsstands, it has to be approved by the Comics Code Authority. So, since then, since the introduction of the Comics Code, it seemed like everybody and their dog wanted to get in on some of the action that EC Comics enjoyed in the 50s. So every comics company out there put out their own kind of horror anthology series. Now the great thing about the horror anthology series is it was often a way for up-and-coming writers and artists who wanted to get into the comic book industry to kind of get their foot in the door, just submit a short story, and if it gets accepted, get put into the series. So it's great. So you see it in any one random issue of these types of comics, you'll see a wide variety of art styles and a wide variety of stories, and that's one of the many things that makes them so entertaining. Now, in the case of Creepy Things, we of course have the obligatory horror host. You'll find most of these have the obligatory horror host that was popularized by the EC Comics. They, of course, had the Crypt Keeper and the Vault Keeper and stuff like that. This one has this guy who looks like he's played by Danny DeVito. Hey, yeah, I got some scary stories for you. Come on in, yeah. He's this cigar-chomping, kind of sleazy guy. And this particular one has, I think, 3 main stories and a short story. So you got this one where these guys are going into the Amazon to hunt treasure, and as it progresses, they go into this dark cave and encounter a giant caterpillar, which they manage to fend off with bug spray. And then, in the end, I think the guy ends up finding, he finds this huge deposit of uranium and refuses to leave the cave without it, and ends up being left in the cave to die. Then later, we got another story here, which is a good old-fashioned voodoo story, where basically this sleazy landlord runs a tenement and it's in a horrible state of repair, and he beats his tenants and everything. And then he meets up with one of the tenants who's actually this voodoo priestess chick who casts a spell on him to help out the tenants, and in the end he ends up spending all of his money to have the tenements repaired and just better standard of living and everything. So one of the rare cases in which voodoo has been used to punish evil and used for good. Way to go! Who says the black arts are only for revenge, right? And then we got a nice little story here about a guy who's going through the forest and he encounters a spider web and uses a leaf to lure out a spider to nibble on a gnat that's caught in the web. And he's walking along, gets caught in a gigantic spider web and eaten by a gigantic spider. The end. Yeah, some of them were just kind of quick and to the point like that. Now, my favorite one, and this is also an example of how the covers often have something to do with the story, but are usually not by the same artist, and usually feature slightly different versions of the creatures in that story. Now in this one, there's a little story called Slime, Slogs, and Glumps, where a couple of kids go into the forest, and a little boy catches a frog, and shows it to his girlfriend, and she says, yeah, whatever, that's not disgusting, I can show you something way more disgusting. So she shows him a creature that she found a while ago, and she calls a slog, and that's this little green guy here. So fast forward a little later, little boy goes home and brings home a slog and something else, some glumps, I think. Puts him in his room, presumably to keep as a pet. The parents hear strange noises coming from the room, because these things are kind of squelchy little critters and make a lot of racket, and they're absolutely horrified by them. What the hell did you bring home, little Billy? So the father goes on a rampage with a stick and smashes all of the slime, slogs, and glumps that little Billy brought home. But it turns out that they didn't just find him in the forest and bring him home. He actually was given them by their mommies and daddies. Bigger slime, slogs, and glumps. And it was basically a slumber party with little Billy and the baby slime, slogs, and glumps. Yeah, so needless to say, it's not going to end happily for them. So that's Creepy Things. And this was one that I reread countless times as a kid and really enjoyed it. And I really like this cover. It's like a beautiful painted cover. And remember, kids, read comics. They're good for you. Anybody who says, like, kids shouldn't read comics, kids should totally read comics. I mean, I hate this mentality that a lot of, thick, boneheaded parents have, like, oh, it has pictures, therefore it's not legitimate reading. It's like, it's legitimate reading. There's words in it. There's narration. There's word balloons.
It's better than reading a magazine.
Yeah, well, the point is, it's reading. Your child is taking an interest in reading. Is that not good? Is that not positive? Is that not what you want? I just don't get... I mean, I still see that mentality to this day, even though now, even more so than back then, comics are very much a legitimate form of literature and are often recognized at university level as legitimate forms of literature. So, anyway, fast forward a few years. This was 1978, so I was 6 years old when I got this one. Just loved it. Fast forward a couple of years to 1980 when I was 8, and I got 2 from good old DC Comics. First we got Secrets of Haunted House, which is great. And Mystery in Space. Now, of course, I thought at first this was going to be sort of just a sci-fi comic, but it's basically a sci-fi horror comic. This is like DC's answer to EC Comics' Weird Science. And Secrets of Haunted House is very much in the line of their old House of Secrets, House of Mystery type thing. Now here's something interesting that I rediscovered upon digging these out. It's hosted... Secrets of the Haunted House is hosted by Destiny. Destiny, of course, being one of the Endless, who features quite heavily in the Sandman comics. He's related he's part of Sandman's family. So yeah, I thought that was pretty cool. It's actually hosted by Destiny. So this is definitely a little classier. DC did pretty classy horror comics, I gotta say. They did some really good work, and I know that a lot of people really enjoyed them. So this particular one has some, it has some pretty nice artwork. This is a good old-fashioned people getting pushed down elevator shaft story with a bit of a twist. A couple of guys, scientists. One needs a heart transplant, and he can only get a heart transplant from his brother, and he basically kills his brother by pushing him down an elevator shaft and gets the heart transplant. Oh, he actually needs more than that. He gets a heart transplant, a bone marrow transplant, and kidneys. Gets them all from his brother. And then he's working late one night, gets stuck in the elevator, and then he's trying to climb out of the elevator shaft, and a ghostly hand pushes him off the ladder. And when they he only falls about a floor, but then when they go to try to save him, they open up his chest and discover that his heart is gone. So yes, his brother returned from the grave and took back his organs. Pretty nasty stuff. And this one's actually kind of a nice story. Is called Last Train to Eternity. It's about this guy who is basically been running a train station for years, and he's forced to retire, but he just wants to, his passion is trains and such. So he meets this mysterious guy, Mr. DeJennifer, and Mr. DeJennifer makes him an offer he can't. Ooh, cool. Look at this, an ad for the Black Hole, which would have been new at the time. One of my favorite sci-fi movies. It's kind of a guilty pleasure, but very dark, uncharacteristically dark sci-fi from Disney, which I will do a review of at some point. So Mr. DeJennifer makes him an offer he can't refuse, basically just a deal almost too good to be true, and he happily accepts it, and he gets to run trains as much as he wants for the rest of his life as an engineer in Mr. DeJennifer's toy train set. So yes, he's actually in the train, like he actually miniaturizes him or something like that. It's like some weird thing. Yeah, so, but the guy's perfectly happy. So it's actually an uncharacteristically pleasant story for a comic like this. Now here's my favorite, and one of the reasons that I've always loved this comic, because this is just a classic story of comeuppance. Mikey's friend, basically, little boy adopted with the obligatory skanky sister, raging alcoholic father, and, fairly decent adopted mother. Little boy has to make a long story short, little boy has an imaginary friend who turns out to not be that imaginary. The sister kicks the imaginary friend and gets pushed in front of a car. The father gets sick of the little boy talking about the imaginary friend all the time and whips him within an inch of his life with his belt. He's watching the game later in the tub, and the TV falls into the tub. Later on, mother, after 2 funerals later, the mother is home alone with little Mikey and hears voices coming from Mikey's room. One of them doesn't sound like Mikey. She goes in to see who he's talking to, just assumes maybe he's talking to his imaginary friend again, but she can actually hear somebody else's voice, and she sees Mikey talking to this strange creature. She freaks out, and basically he says, this is just going to be like any other adopted family. Apparently they've been through a few families, so his imaginary friend is not so imaginary, and makes him choose between her or him. And in the end, they get adopted again by the Osmond family with lizard tongues, and decide that they will be very happy there. So a lot of the DC ones actually end, or at least these ones, end fairly happily. And but I always liked this one. But again, this is a case of the creature on the cover not quite looking like, well, the little boy too, actually, not quite looking like they do appear in the story. But that's pretty cool. How are we for time here? Yeah, I think we're going to have to do this into 2 parts, because apparently I have a lot to say about these old favorite comics. It's just great. I just love talking about these, because these were, very much my introduction to comic book horror. And there's just no going back ever since. So we'll talk about the other two that I've got here. I've got 4 total. Mystery in Space and Ghostly Tales in part 2. See you there. Until then, thanks for watching, and sayonara.